Welcome back to the channel. My name is Tronage, and today we're going to be talking about the HGLRC Arrow 3, and we're going to be talking about how to get this thing set up in Betaflight and BLHeli Suite, firmware updates, all kinds of crazy stuff. And even if you don't have an Arrow 3, this is still valuable information that you could really use for any quad to follow along. So stick around! If you are looking for a beginner's guide to Betaflight and really how to get a quad up in the air, you have come to the right place, my friend. Today we're going to be using the Arrow 3 by HGLRC as sort of like our demo model of how to get things set up. But really the techniques I'm going to show you in here are the same that I use for all my quads when I go to set them up. So you can follow along, and we're going to take this through step by step. Now, the first thing, obviously, you're going to need to set this up is you're going to need some software. Now, there's going to be 3 pieces of software that I'm going to talk about in here. The links to them will be in the description below. The first is Betaflight. This is the software we use to configure the flight controller on the quad. The next thing we're going to be using is the BLHeli Suite, and specifically for the Arrow 3, it has 32-bit ESCs, so we're going to be using the 32-bit version of the suite to program our ESCs. ESC stands for Electronic Speed Control, and we're going to be using that. The third piece of software you may or may not use, it's more of a, in case something doesn't work, it fixes it, is the ImpulseRC Driver Fixer piece of software. And I'll show you what that one looks like. Essentially, that's just when you plug in your quad, if it doesn't really work and it's not making a connection, it tries to fix it because it just may be some sort of conflict with the drivers on your USB, and it fixes them so that it works. And it seems kind of magical because it's always seemed to work for me whenever I've went to use it. So if you run into problems, that's going to be what you use to fix it. One thing I'm not going to cover in detail in this video is the binding process of how to bind the receiver that's in this quad, which is an XM Plus, to a transmitter, because I've done that in previous videos. So if you click that link in the corner there, you'll be taken to a video that I show how to bind a transmitter and a receiver together and how to configure them and set up your switches and all that kind of stuff. So if that's where you're hung up first, go to that video, go get yourself bound up, get your transmitter set up, get everything squared away. Then you can come back here and we can start playing in Betaflight. To hook into Betaflight, you're going to need a micro USB cable. It cannot be just a charging cable. It has to be one that's compatible with data, or sometimes they call it sync. It just means that it has extra wires or pins in it, I guess, so that it can transmit information over the cable, not just power to charge something. So you just need to make sure you have an appropriate cable. So when you plug that into Betaflight, so let's take a look at Betaflight, you'll see up in the corner it has all this stuff up here that's, you know, as it is when you just sitting there. You plug it in, and you see mine turn to COM3. Yours will turn to something else. It may be COM3, it may be COM7, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you're on Apple, it may be even something else. It has, I'm not very familiar with Apple devices, but it will change to something else, that's a port that it attaches to. And here's where you may need that ImpulseRC driver fixer. If you don't see things happening and you don't see it able to, like, it didn't just change to something and it's kind of looks stuck, this is when you may need to use the ImpulseRC driver fixer. So I'll show you what that looks like. So when you run it, it just pops up like this, does what it's saying to do, and then it'll say, success, driver's fixed. Yay, cool deal. Now, one thing you'll note now, since I ran that, you'll see up here that it says DFU. We're going to cover that in a little bit, but DFU mode is essentially, right now, this quad could receive a firmware. It's like ready for firmware, not so much ready to go into Betaflight. But by running that piece of software, it'll kind of fix everything. So if you're sitting here at this point now, all you need to do is unplug and then replug in. And now you should be back at a COM3, COM5, COM10, I don't care what, but now you should be able to connect. Speaking of connect, that's exactly where we're going to click. We're going to click this connect button. And then we are brought to the setup page of Betaflight, and we know everything's working because we look on the screen, and as we move our craft in real life, the craft that's on the screen is wiggling around as well, which is kind of a cool thing. So now the first thing that I do before I even change settings or modify settings, what I want to do is I want to grab a backup of the stock settings. I want to have what it came with, so in case I screw something up or I mess it up, I have something to fall back on. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So the first thing I always do for every single quad that I do, I go down here to the CLI tab. Oh, and by the way, if you see I have a whole bunch of tabs here and you don't have all these tabs, this enable expert mode, just make sure you turn that on, because if you turn it off, see I'm missing a bunch, just turn that on and then you'll see all the tabs that I have on my screen here. So we'll go into the CLI mode. I want to see every single setting that this flight controller has saved on it, and in order to do that, we use a command called dump, D-U-M-P, and we hit enter. And it's going to spit out a whole bunch of stuff. Now we have two options of saving this. We could either, we can do copy to clipboard and then paste it into a document somewhere. But easiest way I've found to save this though really is to just click this save to file. You click save to file, it's going to bring up a default file name here that you can just type in whatever you'd like. What I like to do right here in the beginning, I like to put the word stock, S-T-O-C-K. You can name it whatever you want, you ain't gonna hurt my feelings, but I like to do that just so I know that this text file contains the stock settings so that I keep things a little bit organized. And we hit save. The next thing in my mind that I'm thinking about doing is I'm thinking, before I go through all the work of trying to set this all up, I want to see if there's a firmware update. Okay, so there's a couple of things you got to think about when you're doing a firmware update. Number one is, what version am I currently running? And the other part of it is, you just want to make sure how it came from the factory in its ports tab. So I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself. First, what version are we running? Well, while we're right here in the CLI, we can type version, and we hit enter. And it tells us what version of the firmware is currently installed in this craft. And we see it's Betaflight Omnibus F4 V6, 3.5.5, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it tells us the whole story. What we are concerned about most is that this is an Omnibus F4 V6 flight controller, because each flight controller, you want to make sure you have everything, the same. And we're running version 3.5.5. Now, I already know there's at least a version 4 of Betaflight out there, and I want to upgrade this to version 4.0. So we are going to go and do that. But before we flash this, remember I mentioned when you flash a firmware, it's going to wipe out all your settings. A couple of settings that you're going to want to keep a record of from the factory, because they're more specifically about where things are attached physically on the board, and it makes it a little easier just to reference it versus trying to figure it out later on. And that's in the ports tab. Now, one side note, once you're in the CLI tab and you try to click another tab, it's going to kick you out and disconnect you off of the quad. So I just find it easier just to click disconnect on my own and then hit connect, and I'm back in. If yours works, great, but anytime I leave a CLI tab, it always disconnects me automatically, so I just click disconnect so it just works a little faster. In any case, we're going to go here to this ports tab I mentioned earlier. So once we're on the ports tab, we can see where things are from the factory set up to be. So we can see UART6 is where our receiver is hooked up, and we can see our smart audio, or it's actually the Tramp VTX controlling protocol. That's on UART2 and stuff. So this page will be the same no matter what you're doing. So once I got this page up, I find it just really easy to take a picture of it with your phone. If you don't want to do that, take a piece of paper and just write down all the settings on here, because they need to be put back in when we flash the new firmware. And that's really the easiest way to do this, because it's all right in front of you right there. So I will take a picture of my screen right now. So what we do to do the firmware upgrade is we're going to go up here to our setup tab. And you see this says activate bootloader DFU. Basically, that's going to put this quad back into that DFU mode we mentioned earlier. You can also just run the ImpulseRC driver fixer and that should kick you into DFU mode. But essentially what we need to do is put this quad in a slightly different setting so that it's ready to accept a new firmware. So you can click right here where it says Activate Bootloader. And mine came up, boom, now my quad is in DFU mode. If you have a problem, like I said, run the ImpulseRC driver fixer and that should put you into DFU mode. Now that we're in DFU mode, we can go over here to where it says Firmware Flasher. We can click that. And we can choose a board. And remember, ours was the Omnibus. So we go down to O. Omnibus F4V6 right here. That was the flight controller that we have in this quad, so that's what we're going to pick. And then for what firmware we want, well, we were down here at 3.5.5. There's now a 4.0.2, which is pretty cool. So that's the firmware that we're going to select. And I also like having this full chip erase turned on because sometimes there may be some stuff that gets left behind, and when the new firmware comes on, it can kind of screw stuff up. By doing a full chip erase, it basically wipes it out and then installs all new firmware on there so there's no residual things that may be lingering and causing a problem down the road. Then you go down here, load the firmware online, and that's going to download that specific firmware from the internet down locally to your computer. If you're interested about what's going on in that firmware, there's all the patch notes and stuff down here about what changed and what got fixed and everything. And then when you're ready, you can just click Flash Firmware. So I will click Flash Firmware, and that will load it onto the quad. So first it'll erase the chips, which is what it's doing now. And now it'll flash. And I'll speed this up a little bit so you don't have to wait for the flashing process to occur. And once we see this programming successful, that means the firmware has been now loaded into the craft. And then we can do connect. And we're back in. And if we want to confirm that we do have the new version, we can go over here to the CLI and we can type version again. And now you can see we are running this, what we installed, the Omnibus F4V6 4.0.2. So we know everything has now been installed and we are all happy-go-lucky. So our first order of business, now that we're on the new firmware, is to restore our ports tab back to how it was when it came from the factory. Now remember, as I mentioned, I'll demonstrate what happens if you don't click disconnect out of the CLI tab. If I try to just go to the ports tab, it kicks me out anyway. So I just have to hit connect anyway. So it doesn't matter. That's why I just always hit connect. And I'm back in. So we go back to the ports tab. Now you see, this stayed the same where the serial RX is, but everything else got disabled and everything's turned off. So I'm just going to go through and turn it back the way it was from the factory. And it was that simple. Really wasn't that complicated. This is how it came from the factory. That's how I'm just going to set it back up. Now, one thing to keep in mind in Betaflight, every time you make any changes on any tab, down here in the corner, it'll either say save or it'll say save and reboot. You must click that for those settings to get saved. So since we made some changes on this tab, we're going to click save and reboot. Kicks us back out and we log back in. So that was our ports tab, and I just come back in to confirm everything that I set up is still set up. Next, we'll go into the configuration tab. So under the configuration tab here, we're going to go down one side and then we'll go down the other side, and I'll kind of explain the things that I'm doing and what my thought process behind doing those things are. So we're going to leave it as quad X. Then for our motor directions, now you see the way these arrows are distinguishing here. This is called props in, where the props spin towards the center line of the quad. I prefer what's called props out, which is when we click this, it reverses the motors and you see the props are spinning towards the outside here following those arrows. That's what I prefer, especially on my 3-inch and smaller quads, but I also do it on my 5-inch as well, just so that everything's all on the same page. There are advantages and different disadvantages, and kind of a topic for a separate video, but that's just my personal preference. Now keep in mind, by clicking this button that turns the reversed on, It's not actually reversing the props and changing motor. It's not doing any of that. It's just telling the flight controller that's how the motors are set up. So remember, when we go into BLHeli Suite later, which programs our ESCs, we're going to have to keep that in mind. We have to tell BLHeli to make our motor spin that way so that the flight controller and the way the motors are spinning are both on the same page. But we'll cover that when we get into BLHeli Suite. Moving down, this is a F4 flight controller. So down here where it says CPU load, it's sitting here on the table with 8%. That's got a ton of headroom. This can easily handle the full shebang of 8 kilohertz and 8 kilohertz. And that's how I run it on all my F4 flight controllers. We'll leave the accelerometer on. And apparently this has a barometer because I see the barometer sensor lit up over here. So there's a barometer sensor on this flight controller, which is pretty cool. So I'll just leave that on. But I don't see the magnetometer lit up, which is a compass if you're unaware. And since I don't see a sensor for it, I'm going to turn that off just because it saves maybe a few little ticks of the processor worrying about it. Since it's not there, no reason to have it on. Personalization, this is where you're going to put your craft name. Some people put their call sign, so like for me that would be Tronage, so that it'll display in the OSD. Some races require that that's in your OSD, so you may, if you're going to be racing, you might want to put your call sign in this box here. But when I'm not racing, or at least as a requirement, I like putting the name of the craft I'm flying, so this way I know what craft it is. If I record DVR footage from a flight, it'll show me what craft it is, so I can kind of keep myself a little bit more organized. So in here, I'm going to put Arrow 3, because that's the craft that this is on. For the camera, I leave it at 0% just because it gives me full control of what I'm doing. It doesn't try to do stuff for me. If you put in a camera angle, let's say you're running your camera angle at a 20 degree and you put 20 degrees into this field, what it'll do is when you're flying forward, it's going to consider that your craft is always at a 20 degree angle. So when you yaw, it's going to mix a little bit of roll and stuff in there so that it rotates around your camera, not rotates around the plane of the craft itself. I leave it at 0 because that's just what I'm used to. Feel free to experiment if you want to play with that feature. For our receiver, this is the Frsky version of the craft, so we do want to leave it as a serial-based receiver. However, we need to change this to S-Bus because that's how it is hooked up. Moving down here, we can leave all this stuff off. We do want air mode on. We do want OSD mode on. I believe it has an ESC telemetry on here, so we'll turn that on. We have anti-gravity and dynamic filter. That all looks good. Moving down here. All right, so this next section here, the D-Shot beacon configuration, it's just basically using your motors as a beeper and doing the functions that a beeper would normally do if this craft had one. But I don't believe this craft has a beeper, at least I didn't see one inside of it. So therefore, if you wanted to make beeping noises when you flip your switch to be a beeper, you got to turn this on. So I'm going to turn mine on here so that I can at least make it beep when I flip the switch. I find this handy if I accidentally land, otherwise known as crashing, into grass or a tree or something and it gets hung up. It helps you find it because you at least have an audio cue where to look. All this stuff here, I just leave all this on so that if there's any reason for it to beep, it'll beep at me so I know that there's something to be aware of. We'll go back up to the top here. The ESC motor features, because these are the BLHeli 32s, they're actually compatible with D-Shot 1200. Because we have air mode activated, when we arm it, it will start to spin up the props. And I think 5.5 might be a little bit high. The default, usually I'm used to it being 4.5. So I'm going to try 4.5 and see what that does. Essentially, if you set this too high when you arm, your craft may actually start to take off. This is what you want this to be, is you want this value to be enough so that your props are spinning, but it ain't leaving the ground. So if you go to arm and it starts to take off a little bit, disarm, come back in and lower this. And I have had pretty good luck with 4.5, so that's what I'm going to set it at. If you want to turn it up, you know, do so at your own risk. So then moving down here, we have the board and sensor alignment. Essentially, this is just how is everything aligned to how the craft is. Did you mount your flight controller like this, like this, like this? Which way did, you know, to try to get everything squared away. And the reality is this flight controller is put flat, straight, good to go. So we can leave all this stuff at, you know, just straight normal default settings. So this accelerometer trim section, I talked a lot about this in the video up here about the Tiny Hawk. Basically, this is just so that you can trim out how the craft moves around when it's in a self-leveling mode. If it keeps pulling to one direction, this is where you would correct it. Mine's set at 0 because I haven't even done a maiden with this craft yet. Once I do a maiden, you can see if it has any kind of pull, and you can go in there and edit it. Now, if you plan on never using any of your self-leveling modes and you're just going to fly pure acro, it's not as critical to go in here and do that. But I like to do it for all my crafts just because I don't know who may fly it. Like, I may hand my craft over to someone else who's maybe new and wants to just get their feel for the sticks a little bit and might want to do a little self-leveling, and I'd like it to be set up and ready to go and not all of a sudden never having done it and it kind of pulls and flies away on them. So it's good to do it, but not required. Arming, what this is how many degrees off flat will it be before it'll allow it to arm. This is a safety feature. The idea is that it has to be sitting straight up and level-ish, and it'll let it arm. If it's cockeyed or flipped over upside down, it won't let it arm. However, sometimes you want to be able to arm when it's upside down, like in a tree, and you want to like try to like arm it and jiggle it and get it to kind of fall out of the sky and stuff or whatever. So I disable this. To disable this arming, you type in 180. That's what I do, but again, it is disabling a safety feature, so keep that in mind if you choose to change that as well. And we don't need anything else on here, so we can save and reboot. We connect back in, and now we'll go to power and battery. You can leave this both onboard ADC. Now, minimum cell voltage, you can leave that alone. Maximum cell voltage, 4.3. I'm actually going to raise that up to 4.35 because if I ever put a high volt battery pack on here and you leave it at 4.3, a high volt pack will actually be at 4.35 volts per cell, and it'll start beeping at you. So to avoid that, I'm going to make it so that if I put a high volt pack on here, it won't get cranky. And warning cell 3.5, that's fine by me. So for this capacity portion, I leave it at 0 because I have too many different packs that I'd be on too many different craft to specify how many MAH is on any given pack that this craft may have. So I leave it at 0, but you're free to play with that if you choose. The voltage meter, this is where you would calibrate your voltage meter to make sure what the craft thinks is the voltage is what the actual voltage is. It's usually pretty good from the factory, but sometimes you need to tweak it out. However, that would be a topic for a different video because it is a little bit of a lengthy process to go through and do that, and it's beyond the scope of what I'd like to show how to do here. Suffice to say, typically, you'll get close enough with the stock values. Same thing with the amp meter. You can just leave this as stock if you choose to fly. Like personally, I fly by voltage and time. I don't really worry about the amp usage of my craft. It's just my personal preference. I find it easier just to land when voltages reach a certain point. I find it easier to land based on time, not by how much power my craft has used. They're each to their own, but that's a topic for another video of how to calibrate this. There's two ways. One's very terrifying, involving having to run your motors at full speed with props on while holding it down. And the other is a little bit more tedious and not as accurate, but it does get the job done. Both of which are rather lengthy, and perhaps maybe I'll make a video of that in the future. But suffice to say, you can get kind of close with just the default values. And that's pretty much it for here, so we can click save. Failsafe tab. Basically over here, this is what it does when it loses connection from your transmitter. Flies out of range, whatever the case is, you turn your radio off. What should the craft do? Ideally, what I would like it to do is fall out of the sky because I don't want it to hurt anybody. So here's how I set mine up. I leave this all as stock except for one change. For this throttle section, it says auto. What auto means is that the moment it loses connection, it's going to drop the throttle to 0. And that's going to cause it to fall. Now, I'd like it to give it a half of a second of hope. So what I do is I take my throttle and I leave it as hold. What that's saying is wherever my throttle position was when it lost connection, keep it there. So even if I'm doing a full punch out, full throttle, it's going to leave it at full throttle. However, I'm going to now, when we go over here over to stage 2, it's only going to hold that for, if you look here, it says 4 here. I'm actually going to change this to a 5. Guard time for stage 2 activation after signal loss, 1 equals 0.1 seconds. So a 5 equals 0.5 seconds. So that means when it thinks it's about to loses its connection, it's going to wait a half a second before actually killing it. So if that means that I was in the middle of a throttle and a full-on punch out, that's fine, because I think for a half of a second is no big deal. But if I was in the middle of trying to throttle out of something, rather than crash, I might be able to recover out of it if I do have a failsafe. So that's why I set this to hold, but only for a half of a second. Back up to here to this failsafe switch. I like to personally set a failsafe switch, and I like to set it as a kill switch. So we'll go over that when we set up our switches in a little while. What do I want it to do when the failsafe kicks in? I just want it to drop out of the sky and fall like a brick. Again, on this screen, everything looks good, so we'll save and reboot. Pid tuning. So PID tuning, this is the thing I say all the time, and I will say it again. I know you probably want to know what's my PIDs and how you set it up and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, guess what? The PIDs on here are stock PIDs. You can look at them all you want, but everything on here is stock, and I am not going to change anything on here at all, at least for a little while. Why? Because how can you make improvements on something unless you know where you're starting from? The point is, I always fly a new craft with stock PIDs and get a feel for it. Then if you want to start tuning, you can tune it, and then you know, wow, that felt better, or wow, that didn't feel so good. But if you just try doing it before you know your baseline of where you're starting, it's hard to tell whether you're making improvements or not. And also, by the way, with Betaflight 4.0, the stock PIDs are pretty darn good if you don't want to even mess around with doing any kind of tune. So it's pretty decent. I was actually very impressed the first time I played around with 4.0 on the HGLRC XJB. It flew pretty darn good when I set it up. So in any case, this is where you do your PID tuning. However, I am leaving it completely as stock. Receiver. So this is where we're going to make sure our receiver is working and set up properly. So I'm going to just turn on my receiver.
Welcome to OpenTX.
And now that my receiver is turned on, you see I have my throttle, I have yaw, I have my pitch, and I have my roll. So I know all my sticks are working properly, and my switches that I can flip are all flipping properly, so that I know everything is working as planned. Except I am noticing a few things, that this is where you want to adjust your transmitter to match what the flight controller is seeing. And what I'm seeing here is that these should all be at 1500 while they're sitting idle, and they're not. And their travel should be, this one should be 1000, it's 104, and it should travel to 2000, and it is. So I can see in here, I have to go into my radio, not in Betaflight, but in my radio, and adjust my sub trims and stuff within the menu to balance that all out so that it goes exactly from 1000 to 2000 with 1500 in the middle. So if you would like to see how to go into a Taranis X9D Plus and make the adjustments to the sub trim and the center point, you can check a link in the corner there. I have a video that shows how I go through and actually set this up very in depth. If the card's not up there, you can always check in the description below. That's where the information will be. But suffice to say, I'm going to do this now, but you don't have to watch. I'm just going to cut to it and get it done. Okay, so now as you can see, it took only a couple minutes, but now everything is sitting here at 1500 center line. But as I move my sticks, it'll go from 1000 to 2000. And that's what you want. You want everything centered in the middle at 1500 with that as your movement for your sticks. So now that we have that all set up and everything looks pretty, we can hit save and we can move on to modes. So if you did watch that video earlier that I talked about how to bind your craft to your transmitter and stuff like that, you'll also have learned how I have my switches set up and everything. But your switches may be different, so I'm just going to go through. Here's where you set up your switches and what they do and how they work. So I'm just going to go through them and show you how to do that and how to set them up. So for arming, we're going to add a range. Now my arm switch is going to be one of my switches. Now if you leave this as auto and you just flip that switch, it will set it to whatever it is. So you don't need to know what aux channel each switch is, which is great if you forget. So you can just leave it as auto and flip the switch you want it to be, and then it'll detect what that channel is. Now, when I want to arm, I want the switch in this lower position. So you see this little yellow thing that moves here? I put in the middle position, it bounces to here, and I put in the upper position, it goes to here. So when I want it to arm, I want it to be in this down position, which means I have to move this over this way, and I'll tighten this up a little bit here. So this way, when this yellow thing is within this zone, it will arm. So that's why I have that set up as such. Now I use a different switch to adjust whether I'm in angle mode, horizon mode, acro mode, whatever mode I want to be in. So that's what we'll set up now. It's a 3-position switch, and there's 4 modes that you could potentially want to be in. Angle mode, horizon mode, acro mode, or turtle mode, which is the flip over crash mode. So I've decided to not use angle mode on my switch anymore. I just use horizon, turtle, and acro. So this angle switch, I'm not going to add an angle switch. Now, if you want to fly in angle mode, you can add one here. I'm not going to add one because I don't use that mode. So horizon mode I do use, so I'm going to add a range. I'm going to flip the switch just so it finds it, and this is the switch. And I like my horizon mode to be in the middle position of this switch, and I'll tighten this a little bit up. Like that. Now, keep in mind, there isn't going to be a mode for acro, okay? That just means if no other mode is active, then acro is active. So keep that in mind when you're setting these up. So for this switch, when I put it into this position, there's not going to be anything defined here, and there's not going to be anything labeled as acro. So because there's nothing here, acro becomes active, if that makes a little bit of sense. If you don't understand, leave a comment below. I'll be more than happy to try to explain it to you a little more in depth. But essentially, if you follow along, acro mode will be active as long as no other modes are active. Failsafe, remember I told you we're going to make a failsafe kill switch, so we're going to add a range. That's my switch I want it to be on. And it's going to be over here. And tighten that up. Maybe a little bigger. Beeper mode, add a range. And I want to put that on that same switch. When I put it in kill switch mode, I also want it to be beeping at me so I know where my quad is. So that's how I set this up. Okay, camera control, camera control. None of these I use, so I'm just flip. Okay, so here's flip over crash. Add range. My switch here is aux 1, and I want it in this position. So I'll pull this over here. And you can play with this. There's no right or wrong answer. This is just which switches I use to do what and what position I want them in to make these things happen. Now, I do use a pre-arm, which means I have to flip that switch before I can arm. And I use the temporary switch that's on the X9D plus on the right side. So I'm going to add a range. And when I pull that switch up, it goes to over here. So I'm going to set that up. So now in order to arm, I have to, if I let that switch go, it goes down to over here. So in order to arm, I have to pull that switch up first, hold it, and then click that arm switch to actually arm. It's like a 2-stage arming, so I don't accidentally just flip a switch and arm when I'm not really meaning to do it. VTX pit mode, I do use that. We'll add that, and I put it on this switch into that position here. And then come out of that so I don't accidentally leave it in pit mode. And that's it. So that's how I've set mine up. You can, by all means, change it if you wish. But if you notice, the modes here were the flip over crash mode here. And at the top, we have angle and horizon. So if angle isn't active, and horizon isn't active, and turtle isn't active, then that means acro will be active. So that's how you have acro mode turned on. You basically just set it up so that the other ones are off. And then that's when acro is turned on. So we'll hit save. And now you can see, since we've saved it, depending on what switches are in which position, things will light up. So right now this switch is in the correct position to activate failsafe and activate beeper. But if I move that switch, these will then turn off because this switch doesn't fall within this zone. And that's the way you kind of set up your modes. Adjustments tab, we're not going to use anything on here. Servos tab, we're not going to do anything on here. Motors tab, we will do something on here in a moment when we go to do the BLHeli stuff. We're going to use this to just see how our motors are spinning by default, and then we're going to use BLHeli to configure them so that they're spinning the correct way. So we'll come back to the motors tab. The OSD tab. This is where you put what you want to be on your screen while you're flying FPV that you can see. Now you can go, there's different OSD profiles. You can have profile 1, profile 2, profile 3, different, you may want one for racing, and then you may want a different OSD layout for if you're doing freestyle, and you may want a different OSD. So it allows you to have a couple different ones set up. I really like to just have the same OSD across the board. And it's really just as simple as this. You can turn on something like, let's say, craft name. You turn that on, and here it is, arrow 3. Remember I typed in arrow 3 for craft name earlier? Well, here it is. If you want to move it, you just click and drag. You put it wherever you want on the screen, and it'll put it there. And its anchor point is this little dark box where my cursor is. It's going to be its anchor point, and it's going to put it there. And away you go. Now, keep in mind, right now, this is set as auto. So it's showing what's called a PAL. If I see this, nothing changed. Because PAL has like a bigger square, I guess. If you go to NTSC, you'll see it got a little bit smaller. Why is this important? Because if you set this on auto, and you take something, you put it down here, and you think, okay, I'm going to put it at the bottom of my screen, but your camera's actually doing NTSC, you ain't going to see that arrow down there. It ain't going to relocate it. It's just going to not be there. You're not going to see it. So, keep that in mind when you set this up. Make sure you know whether you're in PAL or NTSC so you know how much of that screen to use. So while a quick aside to this OSD, let's talk about this camera that is on the Arrow 3. It came from the factory set up in PAL mode at a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is kind of the opposite of what I like mine configured as. I like mine to be configured as NTSC because that's how I have all my OSDs set up. So it's just easy to have everything the same. And my goggles are a 4x3 goggle. The camera needs to be a 4x3 camera so everything looks correct. How do you know if things are jiving 4x3 versus 16:9? Simple. Take your camera lens off of your camera and hold it an inch in front of your camera while you're looking through your goggles at the view. If your lens cap looks round, everything is good. If your lens cap looks oval shaped, either squished this way or squished down, that means you're mismatched. Because a circle should look like a circle proper. If it doesn't look like a circle, something's mismatched. In order to change the settings of this camera, you will need one of these little OSD joysticks. This is a Caddx one that I did get from a different camera that I purchased separately. The Arrow 3 does not come with one of these little joysticks. It's really simple though. You just get yourself a little joystick. It plugs into a little port on the back of the camera that's empty. You just plug it in there. Then you just use the joystick to make the changes. All I did is I changed mine from PAL to NTSC, and I changed mine from 16:9 aspect ratio to a 4x3 aspect ratio, so everything worked good for my particular setup. Your results may vary. You can play with this and turn on and off whatever you want on this whole list of different things that will display on your screen, and you have all kinds of warnings you can have. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I set mine up, but you can play with this however you want. Now, to show you how I set mine up, I'm also going to show you how to restore stuff. Remember in the very beginning, we backed up all the settings? Well, now I'm going to teach you how to restore those settings. Because what I like to do is I keep a little text file of just my OSD settings. So each new quad that I get, I can just copy and paste, throw those settings in, and boom, my OSD sets up, and I don't have to worry about all the other settings and screwing them up. So in order to restore some settings, we're going to go back to this CLI because we're done. I mean, OSD tab, you can play with it or you can follow along with how I have mine set up. Sensors tab, we're not, this is not really for setup. This is more for like troubleshooting and just seeing what sensors are showing what information and stuff. In fact, I want to see barometer. Yeah, it does have a barometer in it. It does, as it goes up, and as it comes down, it does. So it does have a barometer. That's pretty cool that it has one. We can turn that off. And then black box, I just have this set to no logging. I don't think it actually has black box storage on here. No, I don't see. Yeah, it just has where you would, yeah. So there's no black box storage on here, so we don't have to worry about black box anyway. So back to the CLI. Here's how you restore settings back into Betaflight. This is if you screwed something up and you want to restore your stock settings. Keep in mind, the stock settings were for Betaflight 3.5.5. We're now on 4.0.2. So if you want to restore it back to factory, make sure you also restore your firmware back to factory because settings and names and things of settings change from version to version to version, especially going from 3. Blah, blah, blah to 4. Blah, blah, blah. So keep that in mind. If you want to restore to stock, you have to not only move your settings over, but you have to move your firmware back to what it was also. In any case, we open up that file we had before here, and I created a little text. All I do is I take one of these text files and I edit it. And all I do is I take out all the parts that are labeled. All I do is take all the parts that say OSD. So anything that said OSD, I kept that separate. And that's all this text file has is all the OSD settings. But it could be anything. We could open up this file and you can see we have all of our stock settings here. So all I do is I just go down to here wherever I get to OSD, about here, and you just delete from here up. And then you would just come down to here and you delete from here down once you have it set up. This is just the stock one, so don't go editing your stock one. Keep that in mind. This is the stock. Once you have your OSD the way you like it, you can go into the CLI, you do your dump, then just pick out your OSD section, and that you can save as a separate file like I did. So all I have to do here, I can go here where I have all my OSD settings. I can select all of that. I can copy it, go back to your CLI, and you just paste it in. And it looks like I only pasted one line in, but I actually pasted everything. You just can't see it yet. You push enter, and it's loading that all into Betaflight. And then in order to save that now to the quad, we have to type save, S-A-V-E. We hit enter. It just saved that all to the quad. And now when we connect back in, we go to the OSD. This is how I have my OSDs all set up. I have my crosshairs, my battery voltages, my warnings, my timers, my name. This is just how I have mine set up. If you like it, great. If not, you're free to configure it however you like, but this is how I run all my OSDs. And it just, you see how quick and easy that was. I didn't have to mess around with moving things and clicking things and turning things on and off. I just inserted and off you go. But that's also how you would load any other settings of any other backups that you make. You just put it into the CLI, copy and paste it, boom, type save, and it puts it back onto the quad. So that's pretty much Betaflight in general. But remember, as I said in the beginning of this video, we do still have to go and set up our motors in the BLHeli Suite. So to see which direction our motors are currently spinning in, let's go to our motors tab. And remember, we have to have our props off, and I have my props off. You also will need a battery at this point, so I'm going to connect my battery. And then we click here, the I understand the risks, because our props are off. And then we can raise our master up a little bit. And as we do that, we can start to see which way our motors are spinning, and clearly mine are spinning props in instead of props out. So basically all 4 motors need to have the directions reversed so that they'll spin properly for the flight controller to work correctly. So we'll drop this back to nothing. And we have to disconnect out of Betaflight because we can't be connected with Betaflight and BLHeli Suite at the same time. So now we'll go into our BLHeli Suite. And if this is the first time you're running the BLHeli Suite, the first thing you need to do when you fire it up is you have to go over here to what interface do you want. And you want to click this one, the Betaflight Clean Flight Bootloader one. This is going to let you use your flight controller as an interface to get to your ESC so that your computer can talk to your ESCs. And you'll notice here that it's set up very similar to that of Betaflight in that we have COM3 here, which is what I had at Betaflight, which was COM3. So we'll click connect. Now what that did is that connected to the craft, but I haven't actually read the ESC data out yet. So in order to do that, we're going to click read setup. And that's actually going to pull the information out of each of the ESCs. And as you can see now, it shows all of the information about these ESCs. They're the HGLRC forward ESCs. They're running revision 32.6, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So at this point now, all the data has been pulled out of the craft, and now the BLHeli Suite knows what it's working with. Now, if we want to see if there's any kind of firmware updates to the ESC, we can do this flash BLHeli here. So we can click that. And you can see it's coming up with the current is the HGLRC forward ESC, and we want to keep it that same thing. And the firmware revision 32.6 and the latest version is 32.6. So we already know we're running the latest and greatest version. If there was other versions to be had, you could click them here, you hit OK, and it would update them. But we don't need to do that. We're already running the latest version. What we do need to do is reverse all the motors though. So we have to do that for the ESCs, tell them to all be reversed. So what we can do down here is these are the ESCs, number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. So now I have to right click, remember to right click on ESC number 1. Now I'm only working with ESC number 1. And I'm going to change the motor direction to be reversed. So now that it's reversed, I can write that setup. And now ESC number 2, I'm going to set that one to reversed and write that setup. And right click on number 3, reversed, write it. And right click on number 4, reversed, write setup. Now if we go back into each one, we should see they're all still reversed. And that's what we want. So now we can say, we can close out of this and fire back into Betaflight. Let's go to our motors tab. And now let's confirm our motors are spinning the correct way. I understand the risks. Turn the motors up a little bit. And now all your motors should be spinning props out as such. Now it'll function properly within Betaflight. And now you're ready to put some props on here. Just make sure you put the props on correctly so that they match the way that the motors are now spinning. And that's really all there is to getting this set up within Betaflight. There's a lot of things you can play with, the OSDs and the different modes, like which switches do what, and that's completely up to you. But I just want to give you the tools so that it's not so intimidating and not so scary of a thing. And to break it down to show you it's really pretty easy. Even if you want to swap the direction of your motors, it's kind of easy. You just click a few things and off you go. So I hope to help you out, got you some good information, got you through the horrors of Betaflight, hopefully. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, hit that bell icon. It just makes finding my videos a whole lot easier. I hope you liked what you saw. Hope I got you up in the air and flying. Comment down below. Let me know how you did and how you made out with this, and if this helped you get your craft up in the air. So as always, my name is Tronage. Fly strong.